In 1941, a black U.S. soldier was found lynched on his own military base. The army called it suicide, then buried the case for 80 years. This is the story they tried to erase. February 12, 1941, Fort Benning, Georgia. A Wednesday afternoon. 19-year-old Private Felix Hall finishes his shift at the sawmill. He says goodbye to two friends from the 24th Infantry Regiment. He's heading to the post exchange. It's about a 15-minute walk, maybe just to get out of the segregated colored area for a few minutes and feel like a regular soldier. He starts walking. He never makes it. 6 weeks later, they find his body in a ravine. Hands tied behind his back. Feet bound with baling wire. A noose around his neck. Decomposing under a Georgia sun. Private Felix Hall becomes the only known victim of extrajudicial lynching on a United States military installation, 8 months before Pearl Harbor, 9 months before America officially enters World War II. And for 80 years, his story is buried, hidden, forgotten, until 2016, when a Washington Post investigation uncovers FBI case files that reveal not just a murder, but a cover-up. This is the story of Felix Hall. Let's start with who Felix Hall was. Because he wasn't just a victim. He was a person. A young man with dreams, with personality, with a life that mattered. He came from Millbrook, Alabama, a rural town. Poor, like most black families in Alabama in 1920. Felix was born into a world where Jim Crow wasn't just law, it was the air you breathed. Where lynching wasn't aberration, it was enforcement. Where being black meant living in constant awareness that one wrong move, one wrong word, one wrong look could get you killed. But Felix Hall had something special. People who knew him described him as vibrant, funny, a jokester. And here's what's remarkable. He was ahead of his time in how he treated everyone equally regardless of their race. Think about what that means. A black teenager in Jim Crow, Alabama, treating white people as equals. Not deferring, not bowing his head, not stepping off sidewalks, just treating everyone the same. That kind of behavior in 1930s Alabama could get you killed. And eventually, it did. In August 1940, Felix Hall enlisted in the United States Army. He was 19. Why did he join? The usual reasons young men join: adventure, opportunity, a chance to prove himself, a way out of rural Alabama poverty, and maybe, just maybe, a belief that wearing the uniform of the United States Army would protect him, that serving his country would earn him respect, dignity, a chance at the equality he'd been treating people with his whole life. He was wrong. Hall was assigned to the 24th Infantry Regiment, the Buffalo Soldiers, one of the Army's historic black units. Segregated, of course. Black enlisted men, white officers. That was 1940. That was America. The Army was preparing for war. Everyone knew it was coming. Hitler was conquering Europe. Japan was expanding in Asia. America would be dragged in eventually. So Fort Benning, Georgia, became a massive training facility. Thousands of soldiers pouring in. And the 24th Infantry was there, training men who would never get the chance to prove themselves in combat because America didn't trust black soldiers to fight. Fort Benning in 1941 was Jim Crow on steroids. The entire installation was segregated. Black soldiers lived in the colored area. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, a separate post exchange. Everything separate. The base even had a colored post exchange, which still stands today as a museum. That's where Felix Hall was heading February 12, 1941. His post exchange, in his segregated area, on his military base, where he served his country, and he never made it. What happened between the sawmill and the post exchange? That's the question. That's the mystery. But based on FBI case files and investigation reports, we can piece together likely scenarios. Felix Hall worked at the Fort Benning sawmill. He was a rifleman in the 24th Infantry, but like many black soldiers, he was assigned labor duty. The day before he disappeared, his civilian supervisor at the sawmill threatened to kill him if he came back to work. That's in the FBI case file. A direct threat. If you come back, I'll kill you. And Felix came back the next day. Did that supervisor make good on his threat? The FBI apparently didn't think that lead was worth pursuing seriously. Hall said goodbye to his friends around mid-afternoon. Started walking. The route to the post exchange took him past housing where white sergeants lived. FBI investigators later identified 2 white sergeants who lived along that route as suspects. They even matched rope found in the house these sergeants shared to the rope used in the lynching. But that rope was commonly used all over Fort Benning, so the match wasn't definitive. One sergeant denied involvement. The other had already been shipped out by the time investigators got around to questioning him. The case stalled. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was charged. The investigation was closed. Unsolved. For more than a month, Army officials assumed Hall was AWOL. Absent without leave. They figured he'd run off. Maybe deserted. Went back to Alabama. That's what they told themselves. Because the alternative, that a soldier had been kidnapped and murdered on a United States military installation, was too embarrassing to contemplate. So they assumed AWOL and didn't look for him, didn't search, didn't investigate. Just marked him absent and moved on. March 28th, 1941. 6 weeks after Felix Hall disappeared, a platoon from the 20th Engineer Regiment is training in the woods near the Chattahoochee River, about 1,000 meters west of the Jump Tower area. They're doing maneuvers, learning skills, preparing for war, and they stumble into a ravine and find a body, badly decomposed. 6 weeks in the Georgia heat will do that. But they can still see the hands tied behind the back, the feet bound with baling wire, the rope around the neck. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't suicide. This was murder. This was lynching. The body is identified as Private Felix Hall. He'd been missing 6 weeks. And for 6 weeks, he'd been hanging in that ravine less than a mile from where he was last seen, on a United States military installation. On Fort Benning, where thousands of soldiers trained every day, where patrols moved through constantly, where security was supposed to be tight because this was a military base preparing for war. And for 6 weeks, nobody found him. Or maybe somebody did find him and chose not to report it. Maybe that's worse. The Army and FBI opened investigations. The FBI case file runs to hundreds of pages. Interviews, evidence, leads, suspects. It's all there. And it all leads nowhere. Because nobody wanted this case solved. Nobody wanted the answer to be what everyone already knew, that white soldiers or civilians had lynched a black soldier on a military base, and the Army was going to have to either admit it happened or cover it up. They chose cover-up. First, they tried to call it suicide. That's right, suicide. Despite his hands being tied behind his back, despite his feet being bound with baling wire, despite the rope around his neck, despite all evidence pointing to homicide, local military officials initially reported Hall's death as suicide. The logic was probably, if we call it suicide, we don't have to investigate, don't have to find culprits, don't have to admit a lynching happened on our base, just call it suicide and move on. Except the NAACP got involved. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People wasn't buying the suicide story. They investigated. They pushed. They made noise. And the Army had to backtrack. Fine, not suicide, murder. But we can't find who did it. Case closed, move on. Nothing to see here. The black press exploded with coverage. A flyer circulated showing Felix Hall's lynching and demanding justice. Black newspapers across the country, and some northern white papers like the Burlington, Vermont Free Press, blamed Hall's murder on white soldiers unhappy with black soldiers joining the army. They weren't wrong. Felix Hall represented everything white supremacists feared. A black man in uniform, proud, undefeated, treating everyone equally, demanding respect. That couldn't stand, so they killed him. Here's what the FBI case file suggests, but doesn't prove. Multiple people were involved. This wasn't one person acting alone. Kidnapping a soldier, subduing him, binding him, hanging him. That takes coordination. That takes planning. That takes multiple participants. The FBI focused on those 2 white sergeants who lived along Hall's route. The rope match. The timeline. The opportunity. They had suspects. They had evidence. They had a case. And they did nothing. Why? The Washington Post investigation in 2016 faulted the FBI and War Department for failing to take the investigation seriously. They ignored critical evidence. They didn't follow up on leads. They let suspects slip away. The civilian supervisor who threatened Hall? Apparently not worth investigating thoroughly. The white sergeants with the matching rope? One questioned and released, the other never properly questioned at all. It was a farce, a pantomime of investigation designed to look like the army cared, while ensuring nobody was actually held accountable. Because here's the truth. America in 1941 was building an army to fight fascism while practicing its own version of fascism at home. The army needed black soldiers for labor, for service support, for all the unglamorous work that keeps an army functioning. But it didn't want to treat them as equals, didn't want to protect them, didn't want to acknowledge their humanity. And when one of them was lynched on a military base, a place that should be the safest place for a soldier, the army chose institutional reputation over justice. Fort Benning continued operating. Thousands more soldiers trained there. The 24th Infantry Regiment continued preparing for a war they'd never get to fight in. Felix Hall's murder was swept under the rug. His family was told, what? That he died? That it was an accident, a training mishap? The records don't say. But they didn't get the truth. They didn't get justice, they got silence, and 80 years of wondering what really happened. The psychological impact on the other black soldiers at Fort Benning must have been devastating. Imagine training to go fight for America, training to risk your life for freedom and democracy, and one of your brothers, a 19-year-old kid who joked around, who treated everyone equally, who was just trying to make it to the peak, gets lynched. On your base. In your area, and nobody's arrested, nobody's punished, nobody even really investigates. The message is clear. You're not safe. Even here, even in uniform, even on a military installation. Your life doesn't matter. And if something happens to you, the army will protect your killers, not you. James Baldwin wrote something prophetic about this era. The people I knew felt a peculiar kind of relief when they knew their boys were being shipped out of the South to do battle overseas. It was perhaps like feeling that the most dangerous part of the journey had been passed. Think about that. Black families felt relief when their sons left the South to go to war, because war was safer than Georgia. Combat was less dangerous than Alabama. Facing enemy bullets was preferable to facing American racism. That's the reality Felix Hall's death confirmed. The most dangerous part wasn't the enemy. It was home. Lynch mobs in the Jim Crow South frequently targeted black service members and veterans. The Equal Justice Initiative documented this in a 2017 report. Black men in uniform represented a threat to white supremacy. They'd seen the world. They'd been trained in weapons. They'd been taught they were soldiers, not servants. They came home with confidence, with skills, with expectations of respect. And white supremacists couldn't tolerate that, so they killed them, beat them, lynched them. Sent the message, the uniform doesn't protect you. Your service doesn't matter. You're still black, and we still control you. Felix Hall never even got to leave, never got to deploy, never got to prove himself in combat. He was murdered 8 months before Pearl Harbor, before America officially entered World War II, before the 24th Infantry would finally get a chance to fight in Korea a decade later. He died in February 1941, still training, still preparing, still believing that serving his country meant something, and his country let his murderers walk free. For 80 years, nobody at Fort Benning talked about Felix Hall. Thousands of soldiers passed through, trained under those iconic parachute towers, walked past the ravine where his body was found, never knowing, never being told. The army didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to remember, because remembering means confronting. Confronting means admitting. Admitting means taking responsibility. And the army doesn't take responsibility for things that happened 80 years ago, except, eventually, it has to. In 2016, The Washington Post published an investigation piece by journalist Alice Kreitz, A Lynching Kept Out of Sight. She'd found the FBI case files, tracked down the evidence, pieced together what happened, and she exposed Fort Benning's dark secret, the only known lynching on a United States military installation, hidden for 75 years, buried in classified files and institutional amnesia. Representative Sanford Bishop's office took action. Bishop represents the district that includes Fort Benning and Columbus, Georgia. His communications director, Lauren Hughes, researched the Hall lynching extensively. She discovered that Felix Hall was vibrant, funny, ahead of his time in his treatment of others. She learned his story. She refused to let him stay forgotten. And she convinced Fort Benning to acknowledge what happened. August 3rd, 2021. 80 years after Felix Hall's murder, Fort Benning holds a ceremony. They dedicate a memorial plaque near the spot where Hall was last seen alive. Another plaque marks the ravine where his body was found. Dignitaries gather. Representative Bishop speaks. For our country, this memorial is a guidepost for the faults of our past, so we can create a more perfect union which shares its greatness with everyone. Lieutenant General Theodore D. Martin, commander at Fort Benning, acknowledges the tragedy. Today felt like we were righting a wrong, but I know what we were really doing was just acknowledging one. He tells the assembled soldiers and civilians, men and women serving this country in uniform can look at the marker we will unveil and say to themselves, never again in my country, never again in my army. Never again. That's the promise. But it took 80 years to make that promise. 80 years for the army to admit what happened. 80 years for Felix Hall to get even minimal recognition. No arrests, no convictions, no justice, just acknowledgement, 8 decades late, that yes, we lynched one of our own soldiers, and yes, we covered it up, and yes, we're sorry. Sort of. Maybe. If saying we're sorry doesn't cost anything or implicate anyone still living. The memorial stands today at Fort Benning, now renamed Fort Moore, part of the Army's effort to remove Confederate names from installations. You can visit it. You can stand where Felix Hall was last seen alive. You can walk to the ravine where his body was found. You can read the plaques. You can know his name. That's something. It's not justice, but it's something. Private Felix Hall's story raises uncomfortable questions America still hasn't answered. What do you do when the institution meant to protect you murders you instead? What recourse exists when military justice is just another tool of white supremacy? How do you serve a country that values your labor but not your life? How do you risk dying for freedom overseas when you don't have freedom at home? Black soldiers in World War II faced these questions constantly. The WWII campaign, victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home, was their answer. We'll fight your war, but you have to fight for us, too. We'll risk our lives, but you have to value those lives. We'll serve, but we demand equality. Felix Hall never got to be part of that fight. He was murdered before America officially entered the war, but his death influenced it. His lynching was one more piece of evidence that segregation in the military couldn't continue, that black soldiers couldn't be expected to die for a country that wouldn't protect them, that something had to change. President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948 mandated integration of the armed forces. It didn't happen overnight. It took years. The 24th Infantry Regiment wasn't disbanded until 1951, but the process started. And cases like Felix Hall's, visible evidence of how badly segregation failed black soldiers, pushed that process forward. Hall's death mattered. Not immediately, not obviously. But in the long arc of history, his lynching became another data point in the case against segregation, another tragedy that couldn't be explained away or justified, another young man whose murder demanded change. 19 years old. That's how old Felix Hall was when he died. 19. Most 19-year-olds today are in college, worried about exams and relationships and what they're going to do with their lives. Felix Hall was worried about whether treating white people as equals would get him killed. And it did, on a United States military base, while serving his country. 8 months before Pearl Harbor, before the war that would reshape the world. He never got to see that world, never got to see his country slowly, reluctantly move toward the equality he'd been practicing his whole life. The FBI case file remains officially unsolved. The suspects are all dead now. Everyone involved is dead. Justice in any traditional sense is impossible, but truth isn't impossible. Recognition isn't impossible. Memory isn't impossible. And that's what the memorial at Fort Benning represents. Not justice, memory. The Army saying, we remember, we acknowledge, we won't let this be forgotten again. It's inadequate. It's 80 years too late, but it's something. When you visit Fort Benning, Fort Moore now, and you see those memorial plaques, remember this. Felix Hall was murdered for being black and proud, for treating everyone equally, for wearing the uniform and believing it meant something. He was murdered by people who were never caught, never punished, never held accountable. He was murdered on a military base that should have been the safest place for a soldier. And for 80 years, the institution he served hid that murder, buried it, classified it, hoped it would stay forgotten. It didn't stay forgotten. Alice Kreitz found the files. Lauren Hughes told the story. Sanford Bishop demanded acknowledgement, and now we know. Now we remember. Private Felix Hall, 19 years old, 24th Infantry Regiment, lynched February 12, 1941, found March 28, 1941, acknowledged August 3, 2021. The only known victim of extrajudicial lynching on a United States military installation. Remember his name? Remember his story. Remember that the Army's promise, never again in my country, never again in my Army, came 80 years too late for Felix Hall. And make sure it's not too late for anyone else. February 12, 1941. A Wednesday afternoon. Fort Benning, Georgia. Private Felix Hall says goodbye to his friends. Starts walking to the post exchange. Never makes it. 80 years later, we're still asking why. Still demanding answers. Still waiting for justice that will never come. Remember Felix Hall. The only one. The one who was lynched where he should have been safest. The one who died serving a country that wouldn't protect him. The one whose story was buried for 80 years. Remember him, because if we forget, it could happen again, and never again only works if we remember.